lyrics at the end of the song Prodigal Gun are, I am the weak one, I am the idle son. So there's this self-identification as bad, which is reinforced by the social framework as it presently exists. It's not just or even not primarily the individual that is conceiving themselves as bad. They are conscious of being labeled bad by this community. Is that
interesting?
Do you think so? Is that what's
I agree with that. It's an interesting way you put it. I like it though.
Nietzsche and Spinoza both do keep on using the words good and bad. Nietzsche famously says, beyond good and evil is not beyond good and bad. If you'd like to continue chatting when you have your cigarette and your coffee.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about Nietzsche briefly, at least. Nietzsche needs to get a little shout out and a little cameo.
For sure. He's like the first philosopher I got into, and then kind of abandoned him, and then I came back.
That's really interesting in relation to the prodigal son story. That's what that story is about. Absolutely. Abandoning and then coming back. So why did you abandon Nietzsche, and what has drawn you back to Nietzsche?
I used to conscribe to the definition of nihilism that people stereotypically use, where people are like, life is pointless.
Meaningless.
But if you actually read it, as I've gone back and read it, it's really positive.
For Nietzsche, nihilism is just the state of affairs that we face. We don't have true faith as a culture in the old idols. It's the twilight of the idols. We don't truly believe in the Christian God, as we talked about before, the big daddy in the sky, in the way that people maybe did in the past. And where does that leave us? If we don't truly have faith in that, then what do we have faith in?
Documentary kind of almost just shows history in a way to where it does seem very hard to break out of those cycles. You know what I mean?
Very much. A Nietzsche book that's important in my book is The Birth of Tragedy, because the full title of The Birth of Tragedy is The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. So actually, let's look at a passage from that. Consistently, even right from the beginning of Nietzsche's writing, he is exploring the possibility that, as he puts it here in his preface to Wagner, for whom he wrote the Birth of Tragedy originally, I am convinced that art represents the highest task and the truly metaphysical activity of this life, in the sense of that man to whom, as my sublime predecessor on this path, I wish to dedicate this essay. That's how he addresses Wagner there. So, but this idea, although it kind of takes different forms...
you said Wagner.
Wagner.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard Wagner.
I said Faulkner for a second. I was very confused. I was like, did he time travel or something?
Yeah, I'm just going to use my English accent to kind of make completely nonsensical statements to see what I can get away with claiming. It's all meaningless anyway. I can claim anything. So yeah, Nietzsche, right from the beginning of his philosophical career, is exploring this possibility that art represents the highest task and the truly metaphysical activity of man. And things get more subtle with that idea in his later works.
Have you read any Ayn Rand?
When I was doing my PhD on philosophy and literature, purely because Rand is someone who is a philosopher, objectivism obviously, and also a novelist, I thought that would be an interesting test case for me to look at, given that I was less attracted to her philosophy than I was to other philosophies.
Right.
And she's someone who's using the novel. So yes, I am quite familiar with The Fountainhead. Is that the name of the novel?
Her philosophy of art is basically what Nietzsche says, but expounded on.
Ah, okay. So what? How would you summarize what either or
Kind
both of
of
them are
like
saying.
art is philosophy come to life, and philosophy itself is just looking at life. So your art is the way to look at life.
Right. Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, doesn't rate Socrates very highly. Socrates, of course, who's all about knowing oneself. The Death of Tragedy relates to this Socratic desire to know and understand and kind of pin things down. There's, in tragedy, in Greek tragedy for Nietzsche, there's this brief little blip where humans, the way in which humans are grappling with and trying to make sense of their human predicament, takes the form of Greek tragedy, where the birth of Oedipus, where we discover Oedipus and all the other tragic characters. And for him, it relates to the spirit of music. The key thing here is that Apollo and Dionysus, these two different components, come together. So before Greek tragedy, we just have the Apollonian component, which could be related to, say, sculpture. And for Nietzsche, Apollo relates to individuation. So let's say that there's a culture where there are these rites of passages established. The culture has this story about itself. The meanings are fixed. There's this type of person. You become mature by going through this process. There are the elders that, hold it all in place. And there's this order, and we exist within that system. The Dionysian component that comes into that and disrupts that isn't for Nietzsche just pure, what would be considered to be debauchery, say. Right. Nietzsche is quite critical of just the idea of being completely uncontrolled, but he loves the idea of bringing in this Dionysian component that is so powerful that this Apollonian construct has to recognize its validity. And so then this encounter between the two begins. And he relates that to music. So there's a passage, it might be good to look at this passage. He recognizes that, like, in the Apollonian society, there is music, but it just relates to the wave beat of rhythm, whose formative power was developed for the representation of Apollonian states. So these Apollonian states are relatively stable. We can give a name to these emotions. We have a system where, the person can kind of cultivate these Apollonian states. The human being is disciplining themselves in this way that Nietzsche thinks is not bad, but there's something limiting about it. And then the Dionysian music is what encapsulates what is needed to be more fully human outside of that Apollonian kind of straitjacket. He says the very element which forms the essence of Dionysian music, and hence of music in general, is carefully excluded as un-Apollonian, namely the emotional power of the tone, the uniform flow of the melody, and the utterly incomparable world of harmony. In the Dionysian diatribe, man is incited to the greatest exaltation of all his symbolic faculties. Something never before experienced struggles for utterance, the annihilation of the veil of Maya, oneness of the soul, of the race, and of nature itself. So Nietzsche's associating Dionysus, who he'll then identify himself with throughout his career. He's relating it to oneness, and he's suggesting that the Apollonian culture, which has carefully cultivated itself and can explain itself and can recreate itself, it's like the machine that just recreates itself. He equates that with the veil of Maya and appearances. Music goes beyond the appearances. Music disrupts the loop, the self-contained system. So it kind of relates, I think, to what's going on with your song. And music itself, according to Nietzsche, the Dionysian music, is the thing that breaks up this self-enclosed system, that limits the possibilities. There's only certain stories we have the individuation process. You become mature by doing X, Y, and Z. You experience these states. This is all that you can do. But the music for Nietzsche is what comes along and disrupts that and is more real and related to oneness. What do you think about any of that?
I can kind of see that in my own just personal experience from how I thought of myself and reality before and after writing music.
Yeah.
You know?
How would you describe that difference or characterize that difference?
Well, I definitely had a lot less self-confidence. And I was in high school when I started playing guitar. But so it's kind of like juvenile, but you know, like the school system and etc., just how the world was, and then kind of almost finding this magic reality in creating art.
Yeah, a magic reality in creating art. In the chapter of this book on Kid Dakota, there's a lot of focus on Nietzsche. Darren Jackson from Kid Dakota was working on a PhD himself on related to philosophy when we conducted the interview, and Nietzsche was a massive influence on his scholarship, on Darren's scholarship. So in our interview, we were talking a lot about Nietzsche and the idea of discovering oneself versus the idea of creating oneself.
I've never been able to bring them together very successfully so that they could, buttress one another or inform one another.
Sure.
I mean, obviously they've informed one another, but not in a real obvious way.
Yeah.
Right? So in my PhD work, I'm actually trying to bring these two disparate sort of camps together.
Yeah.
Right? So that I don't have these two areas of my life which seem very different. It's trying to unify.
So whereas some songwriters might be, even if they're philosophers also, they might be resistant to using philosophical terms to describe what they're doing.
Right.
Would you say you're more open?
Yeah, definitely.
And I like the idea, like the Nietzschean idea of disciplining oneself to a whole.
Yeah.
So is that partially what you're doing? Like for Nietzsche, we are complex entities, of course, and the idea of finding. This is like creating oneself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, finding is not the right word.
Right. Yeah, creating oneself. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Nietzsche talks about disciplining oneself to a whole. In a passage in the Twilight of the Idols on Goethe, Nietzsche hardly ever says anything positive about anyone, does he? He's normally highlighting what's wrong with some other philosopher, but he likes Goethe, and sometimes he likes Spinoza. And one of the things that he likes about Goethe is how Goethe integrates Spinozan wisdom. Spinoza doesn't think that there's a faculty of free will. Spinoza doesn't believe in good and evil, just like Nietzsche. So Goethe is interesting for Nietzsche because he takes that Spinozan wisdom, but then he unites it with creativity. He sees these emotions as a problem, the package deal of hope and fear. There is no faculty of free will. There is no pure intellect that can just choose to be sensible instead of like having the emotions. For Spinoza, only a more powerful affect can overrule a less powerful affect. So we need to cultivate, Spinoza says, a love of God. Now, God is not the man in the sky. God for Spinoza is nature, everything, the totality. And so if we can cultivate consciously using writing such as Spinoza's, which is all in geometric form. So if I can fall in love with that kind of writing and with what it enables me to understand about myself as just a mode of substance, as just one part of a complex whole that is God. And this God that is the whole thing has no human qualities. The God doesn't have favorites. The God didn't decide to create me in a certain way. I am part of this God, though, and everything is. Everything, and just this is just logically the case. So if we can kind of free ourselves from a lot of our emotional predicaments through cultivating this intellectual love of God and this love of understanding, and this and it comes down to two things like recognizing that fear and hope are a package deal. If I can recognize that and love my cognition of that, then I'll be less swept up in the machine of fear and hope. So Spinoza is very wedded to a particular style of writing. He wouldn't be a punk musician. Spinoza thinks that the solution to our problem is not to be artistic. He has a very creative way of doing philosophy, which he presents as the only salvation that we could really have, and it's through cultivating this love of God, this other God. Goethe is influenced by that, but he's a poet, and he's like a kind of Renaissance man, so he doesn't disagree with
How do you spell that name?
Goethe, Goethe. Let's have a look at that passage, because it is the moment where Nietzsche kind of presents an exemplary person. So Nietzsche, who would shy away from casting anyone perhaps other than himself as having it right. In this moment, it's pure praise, and he's quite specific about what he likes about Goethe. One aspect is accepting the view of reality that we encounter in Spinoza, but somehow uniting that, which would seem to be at odds with Spinoza's philosophy, with a love of music and creativity. And this phrase, disciplining himself to a whole, he disciplined himself to a whole, is in that passage about Goethe. So yeah, I'll grab that. I mean, it's in this.
I was reading Goethe's Wikipedia page.
Ah, right. What did you encounter there?
That he's like I want to be. He does a bunch of stuff.
So the passage that I'm thinking of is certainly quoted in this book, which is a really good book on Nietzsche by someone called Alexander Nehamas. And it's called Nietzsche, Life as Literature. And Nehamas's thesis in this book is that Nietzsche is inviting us to set ourselves the challenge of living life as if we were, a really multi-layered, interesting character in a novel or something. He gives the example of like characters in Dostoevsky's fiction. There's a fair amount of Dostoevsky in this book that I'm writing too. These characters are a lot more complex than the characters that we find ourselves casting ourselves and each other as when we're stuck in that fear machine. There's only a small number of possible roles, like the villain, the victim, and so on. If you look at great literature, there's much more nuanced characters there. And so Nehamas's idea is that we can discipline ourselves to a whole, treating ourselves as like a work of art, recognizing the qualities, the conflicting, difficult to fit into a box qualities that we have, and recognizing our rare power, if we cultivate it, to create something completely distinct from the material that we find ourselves having to work with.
Right.
And the interesting thing about this particular book, as I look for the Goethe passage, is, okay, so if we have the idea that we're disciplining ourselves to a whole, you could say, well, how do we determine if there is no pre-existing self? How does that idea even make sense? Disciplining ourself to a whole, that sentence kind of presupposes that there is a self. There's a fragmented self, okay, and then maybe we're going to bring unity to these fragments, but what is it about that particular set of fragments that warrants calling them a potential self even, as opposed to, if we're back to Spinoza, everything is a mode of substance. Why do we arbitrarily, perhaps, just because we're used to calling this set of fragments Taylor or this set of fragments Simon, why do we assume that that it makes sense to also call either of those entities a self, meaning anything like what we usually mean by that word? And for Nehemas, it comes down to the unity of the body. So, and this is important for me in my kind of philosophical book. On a very basic level, the unity of the body provides for the identity that is necessary but not at all sufficient for the unity of the self. So Nietzsche quite consistently holds that the unity of the body, like all unity, is itself not an absolute fact. The evidence of the body reveals a tremendous multiplicity, he says in The Will to Power. But in most cases, this multiplicity is, from our own points of view, organized coherently. The needs and goals of the body are usually not in conflict with one another. The body and physiology, the starting point, he says in The Will to Power. And also in even the genealogy of morals, there's an interesting moment where he calls upon scientists and physiologists to come in to kind of resolve this problem and determine what's, focus on these different bodily states. That's relevant if we want to keep on using the words good and bad related to how empowered a person is. You said that you felt more empowered when you discovered music. Well, if anything's good for Nietzsche, it's feeling empowered. And if anything is bad, it's allowing oneself to be overcome by all of those resentful emotions. Like that's less good than being empowered, than discovering and owning oneself. What do you think about any of that, and particularly this idea that it's through working with the material of the body that the kind of empowerment that, say, you experienced when you wrote music, Nehemas, at least, seems to be drawing on aspects of Nietzsche to suggest that what's going on there is a kind of overcoming this alienation from the physical self that society as a whole generally has, and, maybe owning the feeling that you have, the difficult, discomforting feeling, doing something with that, experiencing, turning that into art, and recognizing, oh, wow, I just created this thing. And then you have more of a sense of self, and then and forging a self in that way. What do you think of the way in which art and the body are being recognized as morally significant by Nietzsche?
I have pretty much ignored my body for a large part of my life, you know what I mean? Very up here.
Yeah.
But I have this past year been trying to be more aware, because being aware of your physical body makes you more aware of the present moment,
Yeah.
And especially lacking live shows now, I realize the kind of physical exertion I depended on from live performances.
Right, so that is a visceral thing.
Right.
So in the act of the live performance and perhaps the connection with a crowd, there is, although you might not have been kind of theorizing about it or intellectually recognizing it, there's a significance, a bodily significance to the sense of well-being that you had in that context. As a songwriter, if you have this period when you can't play guitar, that has a massive impact on how you live.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I've actually been very cognizant of the fact that I live very differently if I'm in academic mode or if I'm in music mode.
Me too. I can relate.
And one's a lot healthier than the other one is.
Yeah. Which?
Well, the academic mode is usually much healthier for me. Right?
Okay,
yeah.
Right.
And when I'm in that mode, I really don't have any interest in music. I don't listen to music. I don't.
Don't get too carried away with the PhD, please. I know that there's going to be at least 3 more Kid the Coyote records, but I'd like there to be more than 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's this. I'm a big Nietzschean, and I'm glad you've already brought him up. But his recognition of the distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. I think this is a very astute observation. In terms of an analysis or a way to think about human nature.
Yeah.
Human nature. I'm gonna put that in quotes, scare quotes. But because I just feel those impulses in myself, and I feel they fall in line with my scholastic interests, my academic interests, and my musical interests. So when I'm interested in music, I feel very Dionysian. I'll smoke and drink and do these things that I probably shouldn't do.
Right.
And then when I'm in school and working on that, I'm much more. I don't know. I'm more rigid and less sort of spontaneous.
Yeah.
I'm more calculated. Calculative?
Yeah. What is the value of spontaneity? Like thinking from both of those perspectives, and especially as you're in your Nietzschean way disciplining yourself to a whole.
Right. Well, I think in terms of songwriting, spontaneity is really important in terms of just writing something that's unique and something that is different and new, whether it's different and new for me personally or just different and new altogether.
Yeah.
Not making any claims that I've created something.
Well, nobody needs to reinvent the wheel. You have created things, but
and in terms of, obviously that's very important in academic work.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe it's, depending on where you are in your academic career, that can be a lot less important than actually just getting up every morning at 8 and reading for 4 hours and then having lunch and then reading for another 4 hours and then,
So the discipline of getting up and doing that reading and stuff is a crucial component. And
exactly.
In your songs, there's a lot of staying up all night and non-scholarly practices, things that might get in the way of being able to have that 20-page paper with its thesis and all properly formatted. So that's how interesting. I think Nietzsche isn't in a rush to resolve that Apollo-Dionysus dynamic.
Right. I think he thinks that, that is sort of the goal in life, is to apply form to content.
Yes.
But in a way that it's self-legislated. Right?
Yes.
It's not like you're not using someone else as an example.
Yep.
You can, but as long as you're making that sort of conscious decision, right?
It works for you.
Self-creation, right?
Yes.
But you have to mold this chaos that is you into something that has form, right? So
absolutely.
That's always the tension, between the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Only a handful of philosophers, including Nietzsche and Spinoza, operate outside of certain assumptions about what thinking is and about thinking being what distinguishes us humans from other animals. Nietzsche is not caught up in this fear machine, and we also don't need to be. Spinoza wasn't. So yeah, it's the whole book is kind of exploring alternatives to machines such as those which you observe and sing about.